if you're confused, you are going to reach out for certainty and comfort. And many of the things our society reaches out to are the very things that continue to feed despair, whether it's performance and achievement, building our success on cultural accomplishments or work accomplishments, medicating our loneliness. It can be through overreading, it can be through pornography, it can be escapist things like, obsessive gaming, those sorts of things. We're struggling to figure out how to confront and live in reality.
You're carrying a strong message for men, Jon. I want to start here. What's your biopsy on the state of masculinity today? And then I'll ask a follow-up regarding how did we get here?
My biopsy would be, to be honest with you, like confusion and despair at scale. I'm not a pessimist by nature, but I think there's so many cultural changes just around the issue of sexuality, gender, what the Bible teaches, sociological ideologies, how we define ourselves, how biology fits with gender, what it means to be a man. There's a lot of confusion there. And then I think the typical man is struggling to figure out how to thrive in the modern world. In many ways, the world is still built by men and for men, but it is changing rapidly. Technology is a part of that. Cultural changes are a part of that. And I think men are struggling to fit in. So when you look at the statistics, the increase statistically of deaths of despair amongst men are catastrophic. Where a death of despair is just like, I have no purpose to live. And so I think a lot of men feel lost in the shuffle and really figuring out who they are and how to thrive in the modern world.
It's interesting you say that confusion and despair. Do they feed each other? In other words, does a sense of despair, is it exacerbated by a lack of clarity and the presence of confusion? How does that play that out?
No, I definitely think so, because if you're confused, you are going to reach out for certainty and comfort. And many of the things our society reaches out to are the very things that continue to feed despair, whether it's performance and achievement, building our success on cultural accomplishments or work accomplishments, medicating our loneliness. It can be through overreading, it can be through pornography, it can be escapist things like, obsessive gaming, those sorts of things. We're struggling to figure out how to confront and live in reality. So I think those things are a bit of a downward spiral that we get stuck in. And we wrote this book in an attempt to sort of pull people out of that spiral into a hopeful vision of what it means to be a godly man.
So good. So I think about a book like Carl Trueman's work, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and he does a brilliant case study of presenting perhaps how we got here. How do you think we got here in terms of even the specificity of masculinity within the church, and then not just our sociological presence of men and masculinity, but our call? Because the call really sharpens the whole focus, the call from the Lord.
Yeah. Well, that would the first part. I mean, Romans 1 says they did not acknowledge him as God or give him thanks. That's the root of all. The sin of the modern self, Keller said this, is not any particular thing a person does. It's not greed or lust in particular. It's creating a sense of self without reference towards God. That's the root sin. So Romans 1, they did not acknowledge him as God or give him thanks. In essence, to get it right is to say, there is a God and I'm grateful. When you get rid of God, what you end up with is, I am my own God and I am entitled. And that's sort of no reference point for the divine, complete autonomy over the self to be, act, define, or live however I want to without a reference point to something else. That's a huge part of that. So that's a secular shift. And that secular shift, I think in many ways, opens the doors for the ideologies that follow. If there's no such thing as gender and it's purely a social construct, well, then living out of some sort of quote-unquote divine design is going to feel like an oppressive thing that needs to be thrown off as a restricting factor, or it's going to be felt as, an outdated thing that doesn't fit how the typical person without a divine reference point builds their life. And so you've got all of these forces working, and then they start to accelerate together. And then it's not one force, changes in the workplace, they're huge. Many of the traditional male gifts, even just like physically, physical strength, men are physically disproportionately stronger than women in general. They're wired slightly differently. They tend towards aggression and competition more than women do in terms of the big five traits in general. So we just live in a world where those things that seemed pretty fixed and stable have all sort of fallen into chaos. And then a man who is still living with the biological reality of his body, still living with a desire to utilize his God-given gifts in a certain way, no longer has a capacity to express those in a world where they feel like a gift. They feel like a threat and not a gift. And so I think a lot of men's response to that is to shrink back out of fear or compliance and not bring their full selves to the table. And I understand why there's such a revolt against the patriarchy. Many men have behaved badly and used their power to oppress others. I do not dispute that at all. But I will also say there's been many godly men who have used their power for others and brought flourishing to the world and everybody who's under their influence. And I'm basically advocating not for trying to reclaim some nostalgic past or go back to an area of history, even when men's and women's roles were more clearly defined. I don't think the church right now even has the ability to exert that kind of cultural power. I think the main thing is that I want to help men use their strength sacrificially to bless the world and serve others. And I think that's when a man's at his best. Anytime you see it when firemen run into the Twin Towers to rescue people when everyone runs out. You see it with the Ukraine, where the president says, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, when they're willing to fight injustice. You see it all over the world where men stand up and use their gifts for others. It's still, in the midst of all of our chaos and confusion, recognized and honored as a benefit for the world.
Jeez. Yeah, I want to put a pin in this. I want to go back to something you were saying regarding the self. If we find ourselves as the locus of authority, the point of ourselves, is certainty and comfort rather than the measure of stability in our lives? Like, will we miss the entire mark? I think you touched on something really important there.
No, I think if you rely on yourself, what you're asking for is a very fragile identity. And you will only be as stable as the level of affirmation or societal support you receive. And if that is not supported by others and threatened, and if society doesn't recognize it, you're going to say things like, I cease to exist. And so what it actually does is it produces a very culturally dependent and culturally conditioned sense of self. So it may bring comfort in the short term. I would say this, it brings relief, but I'm not sure it brings stability. I actually think it brings fragility. And in some sense, we're playing an experiment. No society in all of recorded human history has oriented a society around our particular values and our social construct. This is a huge experiment we've made. And so we're now, and not just in terms of gender and ideology, in every area, technology, how we raise our kids, how we structure families. Now we're getting a little bit of longitudinal data to actually see, is this good or is this bad? And so now we're getting enough, I think, reference points to say, hey, there could be some wisdom in how other generations have done things. So
that's good. Well, let's get back to what you were saying. Okay,
yeah.
In some ways, masculinity is now seen as a threat, not a gift. These are your words from the book. Basically, an entire generation of men is being told they should abdicate the responsibility and joy, I love that, of living into God's calling for their lives. Can we get under the hood a little bit more? Why?
Yes. Let me give you my definition of masculinity, okay? It is the joyful pursuit of sacrificial responsibility. I believe that's when a man is at his best and most fully alive. You can see this with a 3-year-old boy helping mummy carry the groceries in from the car. That little kid's just beaming with pride. I'm strong and I helped. And you can see this when a a man works hard to provide for his family. Doesn't mean that women can't work hard and provide for the family. It's not it's not in competition with women in any way. It's just, when is a man fully alive? When he has a chance to do this. I think there's something in the heart implanted by God where a man wants to give himself. This is the great Proverbs 31 passage. Proverbs 31 is a chapter that traditionally people think about the Proverbs 31 woman, but it really opens as a warning. And it's a warning against King Solomon. Solomon, at the end of his life, instead of securing blessing for the people under his care and prosperity for the next generation, built high places to appease the wives that God told him he should not have. And those high places would become stumbling blocks for hundreds of years. You will read in the cycles of the kings, they did not tear down the high places. And that's a warning. So that passage says, do not give your strength to women, your vigor to those who ruin kings. And what that passage is saying, if a man is given power, he is not to squander that on pleasure because of his power. And at the end of that passage, it's going to say, speak up for the oppressed. Raise your voice for those who do not have a voice, because that's the role of a ruler. And so I think a man is at his best when he is using the strength he has to work for the flourishing of others under his care. And again, not in competition with women, but certainly playing a role for and on behalf of women.
Let's double click on your definition, the joyful pursuit of sacrificial responsibility. I love that. I love that word pursuit. Jon, what's in the pursuit then, from a priority of heart, priority of schedule? If it's the joyful pursuit, what are the mechanics of that pursuit?
Well, it can be, it can start very, very small and very practical. In my own life this morning, I set my alarm. I got up very early. And I went to every room of my place and I took the trash out, because in the division of labor in my home, I'm asking my wife, who's in school right now full-time, what can I do to help around the home that alleviates stress for you? And she said, if you clean all the floors and take out all the trash, that would be an incredible help. Great. She never has to ask me again. I'm literally walking around going, how can I care for you? How can I support you? What can I do to use the strength I have to create space for you to use your gifts and flourish? So yeah, it can be very, very small, like having a proper division of labor in your home. I think it can be larger, in a partnership. It works out when you're single as well. But again, just my experience being married for 25 years, it can be larger things. Like, hey, babes, if you want to go back to school, that's going to cost us money. It's money we don't have. We've planned for our kids to go to college, but, this is a different degree. Let me figure out how to come up with that money so you don't have to stress about it. How can I write something, work on someone, coach something? What can I do with the gifts God's given me over the years to use that to create a space for you to pursue your academic dreams and to flourish? So, yeah, those are two examples from my house right now. From my particular household, but I think it shows up many ways in our society.
Well, I want to connect this to really a subject you've been invested into lately. I know you've been preaching about it at Church of the City in New York, and it's acedia. In fact, I got the book.
Yes.
You threw a book on Instagram about apathy. I picked the book up. I'm reading it right now. Yeah. Acedia, spiritual apathy. How does it show up in men? Because I see this as the counterplay to the call that we have today.
Yeah, James Hollis, who's a Jungian psychologist, says every day when a man walks up, there were two shadows standing over his bed: fear and apathy, or fear and acedia. He calls it lethargy. We're talking about the same thing. Lethargy is from it's one of the rivers in Hades, and it was the river Lethe, and that river, when you drunk from it, put you in a slumbering stupor. And that's what lethargy does. When you drink and it affects you, you just sort of lack motivation, you sort of lack energy. I think this is a multifaceted attack. So Adam and Eve, what's Adam's great sin? And the answer is passivity. It was passivity. When he didn't need to rescue Eve, but he could have just said, "Yo, shut up, serpent. We're going to obey what God has said." That's not what God said. Did God really say? Yes, he did. Shut up. We're good here. Leave the garden. It was his passivity that did it. And I think in some sense that's the fundamental. I think Larry Crabb wrote a book, and I think it was called Adam's Silence. I may not have the title quite right, but it's a very old book, Adam's Silence. And it was Adam just sitting there passively allowing an outside tyrannical force to manipulate his wife while he did nothing. And I think that is sort of the root sin in the world, is that men don't do what they have the capacity to do out of fear or out of selfishness. So what I love, so again, I'm not after aggression as a response, which is a typical response, which is suck it up, try hard. I'm after proactivity. I don't perceive Jesus to necessarily be aggressive, but I see him to be remarkably proactive. So I think the response is to ask for grace and power to overcome spiritual resistance to our growth. Paul's going to put it this way in the book of Colossians: I labor to the point of exhaustion with the power, the divine power that he so powerfully works in me. So this is, I think, the difference that the Christian man has for the secular man. The typical secular man is pulling psychological insights from Peterson, life hack protocols from Huberman. I don't know who else people are listening to at scale. They're the ones I hear the most. And then he's trying to optimize his life in his own power. This would be my critique of human self-discipline. Human self-discipline is disciplining the self for the sake of the self. But Christian discipline is disciplining the self for the sake of others. And so a Christian man has a motivation of using his strength and energy for the sake of others. And he's fighting resistance, not just for personal accomplishment, which is the world's protocols, but for the kingdom of God and for the good of others. And ultimately, that's a motivation of love versus selfishness. So yeah, I think there's a big war to stop men taking initiative, because a man with a loving, sacrificial intent, bent on helping others, is a man of tremendous value and good for the world.
Yeah, John, the notion of being proactive versus being aggressive is really helpful. So if temperament is involved in how one approaches this, what do you say are distinctives of each, and how do we make sure within motivation, within actions and choices, that we're staying and being proactive and not overcorrecting and thus becoming aggressive because of a fear motivation even?
Yeah, I was about to say, quite often that's what aggression is. Aggression can have a fatal motivation, which is a desire to control, to coerce. Sometimes it can have a healthy self-preservation dynamic if someone's been in a place where their agency has been stripped from them. It's often like a healthy attempt to correct. But I think for the most part in our world today, it's a competition mentality. I win, you lose. And that is not the way of the kingdom. Andy Crouch has pointed out the way of the kingdom is I sacrifice, we win. And that's a very, very different framework that's connected there. So proactivity then is asking, what vision do I have of what is supposed to be, and how do I intentionally take action towards it? Whereas aggression can just be a desire for success or recognition, fueled by personal ambition.
Absent the heart, absent your core definition, and I think this is just a brilliant thread, the joyful pursuit of sacrificial responsibility. Right?
Yeah, and the word, again, the classic word responsibility is the ability to choose your response.
That's good, John.
Yeah, that's Stephen Covey. It's saying, I am not a slave of my circumstances. I am not trapped. I actually have agency and the capacity to choose the way I show up in the world, to choose what happens to me. And when a man recovers his sense of agency, there's been so much research, sociological research on this. People often mock that whole, clean your room or make your bed, but there's so much research that shows agency recovering agency, even in small areas, does build momentum over time. And so, yeah, even the smallest proactive things we can do to take responsibility for our lives. It's also been pointed out, and Viktor Frankl's pointed this out better than anybody, a connection between responsibility and meaning. Meaning is, and that's what's wrong in our modern world. We're in an absolute crisis of meaning. And that's why men who pursue success are often disillusioned, because success doesn't bring the meaning they hope for. But responsibility and sacrifice more than likely lead to meaning. The soldiers that came back from World War II, they weren't successful by any worldly, metric, but they had such a sense of meaning, because they joyfully, they said, we want to do this. When after sacrificial responsibility for others, they said, we're going to give ourselves away for others. And they came back, and many of them would say, bloody, violent, horrible war, best years of my life, most meaningful years of my life, giving their strength out of love for a cause bigger than themselves. So that's very, very different than I want to win, I want to crush you, and I want to look good while I do that. So there may be moments where aggression is required to correct sort of a hyper-passivity, but for the most part, that's going to balance out to a healthy proactivity pursuing the kingdom of God.
That's really helpful. You said this in one of your emails, and I save all of them. They're just gold. You wrote this quote, "We are all trying to figure out what kind of men we are meant to be in the world today. In the past, many identity issues for men were resolved when a man went to work. For the most part, his job and a couple of hobbies went on to define him. A small collection of brand choices let you know who he was. These days, most men struggle with who they are meant to be for most of their lives." And this is the key here. Identity is performative, fluid, weaponized, and criticized. Let's stay on those descriptors, John. Unpack that for us, however would be most helpful. It's interesting, and I'll say this before I turn you loose. I had Nancy Piercy on the show a few months ago talking about her recent work, and we dove into the sociology of this. And she was talking about through even the Industrial Revolution, how all of this came to be, where men went to work, and how the dynamics changed even within the home. But I'm fascinated, and I would love your take again on these descriptors: performative, fluid, weaponized, and criticized. Take it wherever you want.
Well, I think that's the typical person's experience. I mean, now I want to be clear. I don't have a woe is me, poor me, victim mentality as a man at all. And in fact, I'm more with Marcus Aurelius. He said, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. That's my paradigm. I'm not in a culture war. I'm not here. I'm a little bit of a 1 Corinthians 5 guy. I'm not here to tell the world how to be the world, but I am very concerned that Christian men become like Jesus, because that's how we're called to be. So, but I do think there is a sense where many men feel the pressure of culture, where they are told that what is wrong with the world is men, that men are fundamentally predatory and unsafe. They can't be trusted, and what is wrong with history and society is men themselves. Men as a category, not a few bad men, not a few narcissistic, disproportionately powerful and wealthy psychotic men, but men themselves. And so again, so then men try and figure out, who do I become then? How do I show up? What am I allowed to say? Now, I was in Texas yesterday, on Saturday, and it's not as true in Texas as it is in New York. It's a little more stable down in the South. It's changing with the next generation, but for the most part, I'm talking about the sort of hyper-liberal dynamics I experience here pastoring in New York City. But I do think men, the last thing someone wants to be in the modern world is a white man. Now, listen, white men have done a lot of damage. Yeah, white men have done a lot of the evil in the world is because of white men. But what's the alternative? And so people will try all these other cultural categories because nobody wants to be the oppressor. And part of the problem of reducing society to oppressed and oppressor is it's too simplistic of a narrative for human nature. It's too blunt of an instrument to read history properly. And I don't think it does justice to the variance of people within those subcategories. So, yeah, a lot of times men just struggle with how to show up. So what do? They go through all sorts of politically correct or trainings in the workplace. They don't believe any of it. They just shut up to go along and live from half their hearts. I think that ends up being a great part of the challenge. And again, the solution is men like Jesus. That's the solution. It's men who can weep and men who can throw tables. It's men who create an atmosphere that women feel absolutely safe around, and men who can walk away and say, do you want to leave too? I mean, this is a remarkably integrated man, the man Jesus, that we're trying to become like. So,
yeah, what does it mean to live from half the heart, Jon?
Living from half your heart says that you can't bring your full self to the table because you're not welcomed in the larger cultural conversation.
Because of a motivation of fear at the core? Like fear says you have to either self-protect, self-promote, hide?
I think part of it I think a lot of folks, it would be fear of the cultural consequences, showing up boldly as a man in the modern world. And I think the other half would be radical insecurities in the part of the person, their own sin, their own shame, their own secret struggles. And that's a tough scene, man, when you don't know how to show up in the world, so you're left alone. But when you're on your own, you feel like a failure. You don't have you're full of apathy. You've probably got a bunch of mistakes that you've made. You don't know how to deal with your shame. You don't believe God likes you. You've got an orphan spirit. That's a tough world, man. And I think that's what ends up happening. So guys are just living out of duty and obligation, just trying to get through.
Of calling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we've talked about integration and the call to live this integrated life, perhaps shame leads to fragmentation. I'd love for you to talk, we'll get into the shadows here in a moment, but talk about the power of secrecy and shame to paralyze us and thus fragment us for the call and responsibility we have.
Yeah, I mean, shame, there's a lot of definitions. The one I like the best is chronic shame is to internalize a critical gaze. That means your sense of self, when you think about yourself, your internal view of yourself is through criticism. Criticism means to find fault. And so your view of yourself is not one of confidence or affirmation. It is perpetually finding fault in yourself. So somebody who feels like they are full of faults is going to primarily fall into two traps. Trap number one, what's the point in trying? I'll never be good enough. Or, I think these rules don't apply to me because I don't fit into the same categories as everybody else. And so they're just going to it's going to be a shame spiral that it goes further down. And then that often leads to tremendous hiding and secrecy. Shame, if shame says there's something chronically wrong with me, I'm going to create a cover story, as Alan Mann put it. I'm going to tell you a narrative about me that's not true to impress you or to deflect further criticism. And so as a result, you're not going to see me, and I'm going to be hiding in the cover story I tell about my own life. And that's why I'm a big believer in the importance of gendered spaces for spiritual formation. Like, I think there's stuff that when men need to be around other men to be fully vulnerable, to be honest, so that they can bring these shameful parts of themselves out into the light so they can be exposed and healed, and the lies can be removed, the wounds can be healed, and they can get that spirit of adoption that God promises in Romans chapter 8. So that's what they do. Shame says there's something wrong with me. Shame makes you hide because you're terrified of being seen for who you really are, and you don't like who you are. And so you'll build a cover story and hide behind it your whole life.
What's in the strength of that gendered space, if you will? I want to talk about shadows in a minute, but you mentioned that, and I'm just curious about that. What the ability of having these, as you said, gendered spaces for spiritual formation. Talk to me about that.
Well, a huge part of it is, so where can a man go? You think about this. What if a man is crippled by lust and anxiety, struggling with despair, hates his job? Who can he say that to? So he goes to a typical church small group, Hey, everyone, let's go around the room and share what you're struggling with. Oh, man, I did a full-blown porn binge this week. I was full of total despair. Now I'm embarrassed and ashamed of it. I hate my life. I've got suicide. That's not welcomed in that group. He's going to repel a lot of the women. He's going to lose respect in the community of men in mixed space like that. He can't say it at work. Imagine a little work check-in. Hey, guys, how's the weekend?
Hey, HR.
Yes, terrible.
Yeah.
So where can a man go to be honest with the particular struggles he's facing? And that's why I think we've got to create these genuinely safe spaces where a man can just say, guys, let me tell you what's going to happen, where a man can bring his authentic self, be fully vulnerable, and be accepted rather than rejected for who he is, with a community that will help him walk into the transformation that Jesus offers. And those are shrinking environments in our world today. It's not that I don't have a sophomoric view of gender, men and women can never meet together. I don't have that philosophy. I don't believe that women are such a threat that a man can't, none of those constructs that are often used in evangelical spaces. I just, as someone who has pastored for 20 years in the middle of New York City, in an ultra progressive city, still see both genders saying we need spaces to hash out our formation in the privacy of people that get the core heart struggles and identity issues that we face in the world today. So I just think there's real value for it. And we're seeing these break out everywhere and produce tremendous life. Because what will happen if a man is not formed in a healthy way in private, he will show up in an unhealthy way in public. But if a man is formed in a healthy way in private, he will show up in a healthy way in public. And so we've got to have those spaces where that conscious spiritual formation can happen.
You know, Jon, to the extent you want, can you nuance that a little bit? I'm really fascinated by what you just said. I've heard it said for years in a similar fashion. What we don't reconcile or work out privately will unintentionally work out publicly. And that was in the context of pastoring, whatever. Will you nuance that a bit? I want to learn from you in that space a little bit. That's really a powerful teaching point.
Well, it's really what happens under pressure. Under pressure, your true self is revealed. And so you can fake it until the pressure crushes your persona. And then what's really in there will be revealed. And so I think a huge part of what it is to walk with God is to have that's the process of sanctification, confession before the Lord, receiving his strength, receiving grace, having a well to drink from in a desert of, a well of encouragement in a desert of cynicism, a well of holiness in a pornified culture. And then under pressure, what comes out is the things that have been shaped by the Father, breaking off the orphan spirit, making you the kind of man who is differentiated, can stand on his own but still remain connected in love. All of that is, for the most part, private work. It's work of the heart. It's what Jesus calls the secret place. Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward it publicly. And so our culture says your best work happens in the public space. The Bible says your best work happens in the private space. And that's why men have to learn to live out of the secret place. That's where change happens. That's where motivation happens. That's where identity is secured and solidified. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Every time we read in the Bible, we hear the Father speak. 3 occasions. Every time. He's like, this is my son who I love. John 17, we get an inner conversation in the Trinity. And it's Jesus longing to be restored to the Father. So he's in a deep sense of secure attachment with the Father that enables him to give himself freely for the world. And that's what we do in the private space that enables us to perform under pressure in the public space.
It's really strong, Jon. Okay, so we're staying here talking about formation in the private. I actually want to, I hope this doesn't mix the metaphor too much, but the title of your book is Fighting Shadows and plays off the metaphor of a shadow. What's in the strength of a shadow? Because shadows are what inherently, and what does this imply? Well, the central metaphor of the book is the idea of an eclipse. And we just had a huge, recently we had an eclipse here, and it was a bit of a non-event in New York. It was more fun actually watching the people than watching the eclipse. I had some friends who went up to the totality and said it was a totally different experience if you're in the proper path. But in essence, it's based on a conversation where
Jesus says to Peter, Satan has asked to sift you, but I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. That word in Greek, eklepo, is where we get the word eclipse from. And I think Satan overplays his hand and reveals his strategy. An eclipse is where something comes in front of the sun and blots out the light. And I think Satan's plan is to put things in front of our face where it looks like God has disappeared. All we see are these particular shadows we talk about, the shadow of apathy, ambition, sex, shame, loneliness, those sorts of things. And we say Satan puts something, an issue in our life that looks like it's bigger than God, where the light of his presence disappears and all we're left living in is in the shadows of that issue. So that's the central goal of the book, and fighting shadows is learn. And we've got this analogy in the book talking about Diogenes. Alexander the Great, after conquering the world, comes to Corinth. Yeah, and he likes Diogenes because Diogenes doesn't care about anything. And he stands over Diogenes and he says, is there anything I can do for you? And Diogenes says, yes, you can get out of my light. And that's the vision. And that's what I'm trying to say. Like, we want men with a spirit of defiance who, when the shadows of sin and shame and fall over their lives, they with defiance say, get out of my light. Like, I'm living in the light of confession and honesty and integrity and wholeness and a vision of who God says I am. So yeah, now there's Jung's approach on the shadow, which is, but that's not primarily the metaphor we're using, though I think he does have some helpful components of that we do try and integrate into the book.
I'm so fascinated by all of this, Jon, because I keep coming back to this thesis that we're establishing, your definition being the joyful pursuit of sacrificial responsibility, and I see that theme running even through. Okay, if I'm embodied by the joyful pursuit of sacrificial responsibility, I'm going to position myself in the light of truth in these formative spaces. I'm going to be developed in secret, where the Father who sees in secret will reward me openly. And I even think about, we'll get to this in a moment, Paul's injunction to Timothy, 1 Timothy 4, I think it's around verse 15. The Amplified Translation says, practice, cultivate, meditate upon these duties. Throw yourself wholly into them. That your
give yourselves fully to them.
Yes. Yeah, exactly that. Well, let's nuance the shadow a bit more, because I love this. You said that the power of the shadow is derived from an illusion. So whichever shadow you'd want to pick for our context here, Jon, nuance that. The power of the shadow is derived from an illusion. What do you mean?
Well, I think I think one that, perhaps many men and many women too, but many men can sort of respond to is the shadow of loneliness. I mean, we've got an epidemic of male loneliness in the world right now. It's just men feel isolated and alone, like they're the only ones. And so this is what a shadow does. It makes you think, I'm the only one experiencing this. So there's got to be something wrong with me. This isn't normal. I can't bring this up because people are going to view this as weird. And so it creates this illusion that you're an isolated individual and no one will either experience this or understand this. And so the truth of it is like, if I was to put my room up and say, hey, how many of you guys feel lonely, like you don't have any close friends? 70% of the room would put their hands up, particularly in the world. I mean, if you're not a part of a church group, how much relational pressure do you have to put on your basketball team or your fantasy football pros to have to be more than they can? I mean, if you don't have a Christian framework of love, and very, very challenging. So I think a lot of people get stuck with the illusion, and bringing it into the light is a bold vulnerability to say, here's what's happening to me. Is there anybody else? And as C.S. Lewis said, friendship is found in the moment you say, me too, you too, I thought I was the only one. And often that's where we connect, by being vulnerable about the things we're struggling with.
There's an overcorrection that we touched on earlier, and that is ambition. Not all ambition is bad. In fact, I love J. Oswald Sanders' book, Spiritual Leadership. He talks about godly, healthy ambition. But some is futile. What's the line, Jon, between healthy ambition and ambition that divides, distracts, and even perhaps deludes us? I've got a chapter on the shadow of ambition. I open it by referencing James K. Smith's work. He says the two definitive traits of selfish or worldly ambition are competition and recognition or attention.
which means you have to win and you have to look good doing it. So again, now quoting C.S. Lewis, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be the best writer, doing your best as a writer. But if you only find value, if your value is derived not in the quality of your work, but in the fact that you're better than others, that comparative element, and then you feel like you have to make yourself look better than them in order to be better, that's unhealthy. It's the need for recognition and distinction is where the unhealthy component lies. It's nothing wrong with wanting to do your best, nothing wrong with wanting to have a vision, godly vision. Doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's run through a kingdom lens, not a worldly lens. And what makes that so hard is that we live in a sort of a social economy where being recognized, how many followers you have, how many likes you have, is a form of cultural capital that's very, very prized in our world today. So we feel the pressure to perform, to compete. We feel like there's a limited amount of attention that we have to win. And that's when I think ambition is unhealthy. But a godly man wanting to do his best with a vertical rather than a horizontal success metric is a gift to the world. I mean, listen, don't you wish the guy making your... So I'll tell you a story. I was getting on a flight from Dallas to come back this weekend to New York. And I had this Delta gate agent. It was a woman. And she might as well have been running the Four Seasons, mate. Her level of personalized care, compassion, it was extraordinary. And I said to her, I just want to say I've been flying for 30 years and you are giving me single-handedly the best experience I've ever had. She said, thank you. I absolutely love my job. She was doing it with all of her heart, all of her might. And so someone as small as like changing a seat on a plane can change your day. When a man shows up with a vision to do his best, whether it's cutting the grass, doing the dishes for his wife, making a finance report, fixing a truck, whatever it is, when he does it with all of his heart, the world prospers. But when he says, I have to put you down, make you look bad, then it's a disaster. James 3 says, where you find selfish ambition and bitter envy, there you will find evil, disorder, and every evil practice. He says it's demonic, earthly, unspiritual. And so that's what makes us compete instead of collaborate. That makes us feel like we've got to go against people rather than do it for the glory of God. So my whole chapter is on how to convert worldly ambition into holy ambition. I personally think it's my favorite chapter in the book.
You know what freaks me out actually about that passage in James 2, John, is that James says, this wisdom is not from above. Wait a minute, hold on. He's calling that a form of wisdom. Why? Because perhaps the embittered, cynical, insular, confused, despair-driven heart will say, that is the path to where we started today. Yeah, certainty 100%. And comfort, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it's definitely, that is the life hack, hustle, grind, crush it, kill it competitive framework that drives our world. Because if you don't have an upward call, like Paul said, all you have is how you're doing compared to your reference group. And if you don't have anything bigger than this, that is earthly wisdom. Get as much success and accomplishments and recognition as you can now. Accumulate power, privilege now. And so, but Christians are freed from that limited vantage point, that limited horizon. A man with holy ambition has a tremendous advantage over those without it in the modern world because we don't need it, we're not controlled by it, and we're not crippled when we don't get it. And that means we're free to labor with all of our might, as Colossians says, knowing that from the Lord we'll receive our reward.
Yeah, so a called versus a driven man. You've written about this before, and as I said, I'm a huge fan of your weekly emails. And
you're riffing off my email, and I do appreciate that.
Come on, man.
Yes,
well,
yes.
I really wanted to prepare well for this, but I just hope it just communicates the value I have for the message you're bringing, not only to the folks joined with us, but John, to me every week. I'm going, oh, dang, I need to drill down on this. And I meet with a 70-year-old man every Wednesday night for personal mentoring. Have for 11 years, and at 41, I mean, he has access to every area of my life, and I brought one of your emails into that conversation lately. His name's Dave, and we talked about called versus driven, and I'd love your take on this, Jon, because again, I want folks, for the women listening, to champion the men in their lives, for the men listening to also be able to parse this apart. Again, the called versus the driven man. How do we know the difference? We talked about ambition.
Yeah, that's an idea I took from Ordering Your Private World from Gordon MacDonald. Yeah, great book, classic. And he just talks about the difference between the two. I think there's kind of a shepherding analogy will sort of push it out. There's two ways you can lead sheep. They can trust the shepherd and his voice, and he will lead them to pasture. They will respond to a sense of call. But if you don't respond to a sense of call, the shepherd has to unleash the dogs to drive the sheep. The sheep scatter when they're driven. And so you have to unleash guilt, shame, condemnation in order to get sort of the sheep to move forward in the world. A called man has a sense of a Godward orientation, a sense of a desire to please God. It's a divine metric, not just a human metric. Paul will call this the upward call. I want to take a hold of that for which he's taken hold of me. Paul's going to live like a psychotic level of ambition. This one thing I do, forgetting everything. Everything else is crap, scubalon. It's just nothing compared to knowing Jesus. So that's a very aggressive man, a very, very cold man. But a driven man is not going to have that desire to know Jesus. He's going to push others. He's going to use people as a commodity instead of use his strength for others. He's going to have his own success as the sort of the terminal of all of that accomplishment. And he'll damage and use people along the way. Whereas a cold person is accountable for how he treats people. A driven person sees people as a commodity along the way. And so that's why it's so sad. Even many pastors, which is who Gordon MacDonald was addressing primarily, Christian leaders, they can damage the people they're called to shepherd out of a desire to be successful. And that's a real temptation we all face, but it's particularly painful when that happens with a Christian leader.
I think this is a great way to begin the descent of this conversation today, and it's something I know is passion in your heart, which is becoming consecrated men. I loved, and we'll put a link in the show notes to the Awaken Network podcast. You and your co-hosts were talking about King Josiah, and
yes.
I know that's been a theme of your life. I touched on this earlier in the conversation, contrasting what we've talked about regarding shadows and apathy, acedia, drivenness, ambition.
We've got a lot in. We've got a lot in so far.
Come on. Yeah.
It's been rich, yes.
So 1 Timothy 4:14 and 15, he says, don't neglect the gift. That to me embodies and it epitomizes consecration. Living a consecrated life today looks like what?
Well, I think it's primarily about the state of our heart. It's about our motivational structure. It's about love. It's about passionate desire more than anything else. Consecration in our relationship with God has a covenantal framework, not a contract. Contract is how do I maximize value for minimal effort. A covenant is how do I give myself away fully in love. So a huge part of it is like I'm giving myself to you. When I got married, I consecrated myself to my wife. I said, forsaking all others. And consecration is a forsaking all others in the modern world. I think that impacts how you use your time, what you pay attention to, your money, your level of holiness. A fear-based consecration says, I'll get in trouble if I don't. A love-based consecration says, why would I want to hurt your heart by doing this? So I see it primarily as a voluntary sacrifice of legitimate things out of for the sake of love of another. And that other, for the most part, is Jesus. So yeah, it's like, what am I saying no to? Not because I have to, but because I want to, because I want more intimacy. I want to be more usable. That's 2 Timothy 2. Consecrate yourselves and you'll be useful to the master for every good work. And we need consecrated men. We've had distracted men. We've had trivial men. And what we need is men who give themselves fully to the work of the Lord so their progress is evident to all. You can start as a teenager. Josiah, as a very young man, consecrated himself to the Lord. You can start if you've lived a life of sin and failure. That's the beauty of the grace of God. God can restore the years the locusts have eaten. You can say, I consecrate myself to you from now on. So I think if we just get that vision of giving ourselves exclusively in love to another, we're going to live from a sense of wonder and joy, knowing we're connected to the one who matters and we're a part of a kingdom that lasts forever.
Guys, listen up. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord. Hosea chapter 10, verse 12. John, I feel that is the word for today, and like the linchpin to even engaging our hearts as where we started today, rejecting confusion and despair, rejecting certainty and comfort. Why? Your definition, for the joyful pursuit of sacrificial responsibility to be men in the ways of Jesus. And I'm just so thankful. John, thank you for exemplifying this, for modeling this, for giving us this on-ramp to this. I'm just very grateful.
Mate, we are struggling along here. I'm a plodder more than anything else, one day at a time. Today has enough troubles as its own, as Jesus said, but I am grateful to be surrounded by a wonderful team that keeps me accountable and keeps me motivated to follow Jesus. And chatting with guys like you about these things that matter is also a joy. So thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. The book, folks, Fighting Shadows, Bethke and Tyson, two of the best. Oh my gosh, you guys are a dynamic duo. We'll put that in the show notes at wintoday.tv. But John, I'd love for men especially to learn about some of the forming men exercises and cohorts and stuff that you and Jeff are working on and putting together.
Yeah, you could just go to formingmen.com and we've got all of our stuff there. We sort of specialize in spiritual formation from a masculine framework to help men become like Jesus. So we've got a bunch of retreats, courses, stuff we've got rolling out to help people do that with a crew of men. So. Yeah,
I'm going to put an opt-in in the show notes for people to get your weekly email too, because I think it's necessary.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. But anything else today, John? I'm just thankful for your time. It's always good to see you.
No, I mean, I'll just say, hey, listen, the Bible says in Romans 8 that creation is groaning for the revelation of the sons of God. Revelation 5 says, I wept and I wept because there was no one found worthy. We are longing for godly leadership that looks like Jesus in our world today. Servant, strong, empowering leadership. And you've got a role to play in that. And so may God give us all grace to play our small part in the story God's telling.
Jon Tyson, you're a gift. Thanks for being here today.
No worries. Always great chatting, mate. Thanks so much.